Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society, and to our first public program for fall 2024, Lost Literacies, Experiments in the 19th Century U.S. Comic Strip with author Alex Beringer. We welcome those of you who are with us here in Antiquarian Hall in Worcester. We also welcome those of you who are watching us tonight on YouTube, whether you are here in Worcester or anywhere around the country or around the world. We're also pleased to have with us tonight C-SPAN, recording this program for a later broadcast. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Scott Casper, and I have the pleasure and the honor of serving as president of the American Antiquarian Society. Our mission here is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources we've been collecting for more than 200 years. We have in our collection everything from newspapers and periodicals to graphic arts material to books and pamphlets, manuscripts, and children's literature, more than 2.5 million objects collected over 200 years and continuing to be collected to this day. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world and right here in Worcester to use the collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like tonight's program that provide insights into the past and its resonance for our own day. This program is being recorded in addition to C-SPAN. We are recording it here, and it'll be available on our YouTube page following the live stream. We're delighted that you've joined us this evening. As a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Alex Beringer is professor of English at the University of Montevallo, which is Alabama's only public liberal arts college. His research and teaching focus on 19th century American literature, visual culture, and comics. The courses he teaches, I think this is great, include Introduction to Comics and Graphic Narratives and Hoaxes, Hucksters, and Artful Deceptions, the Aesthetics of Deception and Illusion in 19th Century American Culture. Makes you want to go to the University of Montevallo. Last year, Alex won the university's College of Arts and Sciences Outstanding Teaching Award, so I think we're in for a treat this evening. Alex has published articles in the journals American Periodicals, the Mark Twain Annual, American Literature, and Arizona Quarterly. He has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the University of Cambridge, and of course from the American Antiquarian Society, where he was a J. and Deborah Last Fellow in Graphic Arts in 2018-2019. He has indeed been a familiar face here, participating in our 2022 summer seminar in American visual culture and serving on our short-term fellowship selection committee that same year. The project he worked on as a researcher here is now a book, which he's discussing tonight, Lost Literacies, Experiments in the 19th Century U.S. Comic Strip. If you thought American comic strips began sometime around the 1890s or the early 20th century, Alex's book will take you back more than half a century earlier. But I'll let him tell that story. Alex Beringer, welcome back to AS.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Scott. And thanks to the AAS for hosting me. This institution just means so much to me. People like Lauren Hughes, Nan Wolverton, Laura Wasowich, Vince Golden have all been just sort of incredible kind of supporters of my research over the years. And it's nice to meet some new faces like John Garcia. Yeah, it's really special for me to be here. And so, yeah, I guess I'd like to start by saying I'm really happy to be here. And so I've just published this book on 19th century American comic strips. And when I started this project, I had just finished my PhD in American literature at the University of Michigan. It wasn't a comics project, but I'd always really loved comics and always wanted to kind of find a way to bring those two interests together. And as someone who's, and when I thought about that project, I think, like a lot of people, I thought that 19th century comics were really limited to things like political cartoons and racist caricatures like E.W. Clay's image of Jim Crow. That's not Jim Crow. That's Martin Van Buren, and this, of course, is Thomas Nast's famous image of Boss Tweed. Right. This is typically what we think of when we think of 19th century American graphic humor. Right. And in fact, if you look at most histories of the comic strip in America, and by comic strips I mean these images that have multiple panels and tell stories. Most of the histories will start in the 1890s with R.F. Outcault's Yellow Kid comics in the Sunday newspapers. One very important statement in this version of the history was Colton Woff's 1947 book, The Comics, which begins by declaring that Outcault's Yellow Kid character stood right at the volcano when it shot off. And so I started digging. And when I began digging, I was really surprised by what I found. To start, I found lots of things that you'd absolutely call a comic strip. These were neither caricatures nor political cartoons, but emphatically stories with distinctive characters, settings, plots, and situational humor. Things like Mr. Snipkins over here and his little dog, or Mr. Slim's piscatorial experience. And the further I dug in, the more I was surprised and impressed, not just by the fact that there was this huge, large, overlooked archive of American sequential comics, but by the sheer variety of different approaches to storytelling that I was seeing. During this period when the medium was so new, artists weren't confined to established norms for visual language or genre. Basic conventions of what we think of as the modern comic strip, like speech balloons, panels arranged as grids, and methods for transitioning between panels, couldn't be taken for granted. Instead, what emerged was less a unified American approach to comics than an environment where we had kind of competing practices producing multiple ways of experiencing the relationship between image and text. Artists pursued deliberately novel and idiosyncratic approaches to caricature, movement, and the depiction of time. Some of the comics that I found lacked definite plots. Others merely delivered a series of puns. Still others organized the passage of time and progression through space in ways that will feel unfamiliar to the modern viewer. And so this is where the title of my book comes from, Lost Literacies. When we think about what it was like to read comics in 19th century America, there weren't really any well-defined rules. Instead, it was a kaleidoscopic array of shifting approaches. The audience for this first wave of US comic strips was strikingly sophisticated in its reception of the material. The sense of flux, the idea that visual language could turn on a dime, was often precisely the appeal. Rather than becoming attuned to a single format or a single reading style, readers of 19th century American comics took pleasure in novelty. They were alert to the fact that they might need to train themselves to absorb new visual languages each time they opened the pages of their favorite illustrated periodical. Even more importantly, they understood that a comic artist might not simply offer an amusing skit or bit of social commentary, but could issue a challenge to the reader to imagine visual and verbal experience in new and different ways. Okay, so that was a mouthful. And tonight I'm going to divide our presentation into 3 tableaux. Tableau 1, Reanimating the Picture Story. Tableau 2, New York's Printscape. And Tableau 3, Augustus Hoppin Abroad. Now, the story of my book tends to start in the 1840s when we see the beginnings of what I think of as the first consistent tradition of American comic strips. And like many things in American culture, it starts with theft. That is to say that we had bootlegs, pirated editions of graphic albums by the Swiss artist Rodolphe Töpfer. And so what it was a supplement called The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck. And it was this pirated version of a graphic album called The Adventures of Monsieur Vieuxbois. And Töpfer, the original author of this, is notable for developing highly sophisticated sense of timing and narrative sequence. By most counts, he's the first artist to consistently divide panels into distinct sequential events. And in doing so, Toepfer could tell extended stories and portray sequences of actions. His frames are presented in the proscenium view and borrow extensively from the classic conventions of Restoration comedy and slapstick pantomime. And Toepfer's thematic sophistication is also notable. His brand of picaresque was reminiscent of Sterne's Tristram Shandy, with these picaresques. Upstart characters like Monsieur Vaubois disrupted the order of polite society, wreaking satirical havoc on subjects as diverse as bourgeois social climbers, the Catholic Church, and 19th century science. And so the documents themselves are like this. They're really precursors to graphic novels. And this is a piece from the AAS collection. I think you can maybe see my laptop in the background. Sorry, it was taken on the fly. But they're these oblong little volumes, 15 by 26 centimeters. I don't even know if there's a name for that format shape, but they usually run between 50 and 150 pages. They're so unusual. And so these graphic albums, these little kind of precursors to graphic novels, have a pretty good run in the US from the 1840s up until 1860s, maybe 1870s. And so Toepfer makes some inroads with Obadiah Oldbuck, and you'll see references to the character right from that graphic album in letters and newspapers, really running for another 30 or 40 years. So it makes a cultural impact in the US. But where things really get exciting, I would say, is when the comics hit the magazines. And a real kind of key publication with this is T.W. Strong's Yankee Notions. T.W. Strong was a publisher in New York City. And that publication, more than any, I think, initiates the migration of these French picture stories from the format of the graphic album into the magazine. And in the first year, Strong's Yankee Notions featured sequential comic art in each issue, including a serialized Toepferesque picture story called Jeremiah Oldpot. And Jeremiah Oldpot is about this New York tin merchant who decides he's going to go west to pan for gold. And it features these just truly madcap gags. So for instance, on the left, what are we looking at? It's Jeremiah Oldpot's electro-galvanized suit. And then on the right, I don't know if I should share this, but I will. On the right, what's going on is that Oldpot's children are so embarrassed by the electro-galvanized suit and all these funny get-ups that he's wearing that their eyeballs have popped out of their heads and are flying away like little butterflies. You know, I mean, in an extra savage twist, right? His wife certainly is trying to catch the butterflies, the little eyeballs, but so is the dog. Okay, and I'll send that one out to my new Australian shepherd puppy at home. Anyway, it's clear to me though that Strong and all of these figures, they're not just reading the French graphic albums that are coming over to the US, but they're reading French magazines as well. How do we know that? Because they're ripping them off, okay? And so what we're looking at in this set of frames really are, on the left, you have original French picture stories by Cham appearing in L'Illustration, the French magazine. And on the right, what you have are images from from Jeremiah Oldpot. And so they've literally, you know, drawn like a coonskin hat over his head. And so, oops, sorry. And so it's just fascinating with Strong, the way he's kind of repurposing and reusing these plates. And part of the reason that a publisher like Strong is so important, what happens in comics in the years that followed, has a lot to do with innovations in the illustrated publishing industry. During this time, that is the early 1850s, New York becomes an absolute hotbed of innovation, not only for creating comics, but mass-produced illustrated publications of all sorts. The area along Nassau and Fulton Street that would eventually become known as Newspaper Row was dotted with publishing houses that catered to working and middle-class demand for the spectacle provided by inexpensive printed images. A lot of this is driven by new printing technologies. So a really kind of key innovation is the electrotype. And the electrotype essentially allows them to start using steam-powered presses in large quantities. So that prior to the electrotype, with images in particular, if you made too many impressions, you'd crush the block. Okay, and so that's not the case in the early 1850s, right? And they're just absolutely off to the races. And the economies of scale on this are just stunning. For a point of comparison, an illustrated publication like D.C. Johnston's Scraps, which is in the 1840s, that cost $1 per issue, right? So about, I don't know, $40 to $50 in today's money. Illustrated monthly magazines of the 1850s are 10 to 15 cents per issue at 30 to 40 pages. And so if you're doing the math there on the back of your napkin, what you'll realize is that per page, illustrated images cost 1/100th of what they had costed just 10 to 12 years earlier. It's really kind of stunning. And T.W. Strong's publishing house is at the epicenter of these various developments, and he is capitalizing on it. Between the early 1840s and the mid-60s, Strong builds this thriving publishing firm known for its diverse variety of illustrated printed material. And the commercial and spectacular appeal of these illustrations really pops out in a striking advertisement for Strong's publishing house. The promotion here, what you can see are people kind of gathered around this window, and they're looking at all the printed images that Strong has for sale. And so according to the advertisement, these include things like primers, child's ABCs, valentines of 1,000 kinds, he likes that little rhyme in there, envelopes in fancy laced, and embroidery paper in endless variety. Okay, and Strong and his associates, through these various things, are experimenting with visual narrative all along. This image is from what's called a comic almanac. So it's just this little kind of, almost like reference, but it has like jokes and cartoons and things in it. And so the image here, we'll zoom in on that, is from 1839. So this is pre-Obadiah Oldbuck. This is before the kind of sequential revolution starts in the U.S. And so you can already see them kind of playing around with different combinations of image and text. But Strong, alongside things like this, are doing children's books, right? So this is an accordion-style book, and thanks to Laura Wasowich for kind of putting this in my hands. But to manipulate something like this, you would flip back and forth. Another one from Strong is Sailor Boy, Powder Boy, and this is more like a kind of fanned thing where you're exposing text and then you're exposing an image. And if you follow it along and fold and fold and fold, you follow a young boy's progression from being kind of a little sailor boy up to being admiral, okay? And for Strong, even the covers of Yankee Notions are working in this way. So for instance, this is a kind of full print of the first, what would that be, 9 issues of Yankee Notions. And so what you find is that each sort of magazine cover has a different thing that their mascot is doing. And of course, Strong decides that he's going to make more money on this by publishing it as a single print, in addition to kind of all of the magazines. Okay. And of course, this is extending to the comics. Okay. And what you start seeing is not only Strong's magazine, but other magazines deploying what I would describe as a wholly gimmicky approach to comics. I think of these as like comics of attraction, similar to like the cinema of attraction, where every time you do a comic, you give an artist a sort of new way, you give the audience a new way of kind of thinking about visual narrative. So for instance, this image is called Egyptian Intelligence. And so it's got this key, with these Egyptian kind of looking hieroglyphs. And kind of the joke with the comic is that it seems, I think, to a viewer in 1852, 1853 as this kind of exotic kind of thing. But if you read the key, what you find out is that these are college students, and they're doing all the same kinds of things that college students do in sort of 1850s and today for that matter, whether it's worrying about their next date, worrying about what they're going to wear, worrying about their thesis defense, things like that. Captions were a really, really rich source of play and innovation. So this, for instance, is 4 experiences in waltzing. And what's neat about this one, they have this little direction for explanation. The unmusical reader will, ask any lady and her piano, And what it boils down to is that you can play this comic, okay? Mm-hmm. And you can see the kind of tempo speeding up, and the gag, of course, is in that 3rd frame, right, where things, get really, I don't know what you'd call those, 20th notes, I'm not sure. But then, of course, it ends on a fermato with the bum, right, and he falls on his bum. Shadows over the way, another of these kind of one-off types of designs, at first glance really looks like sequential images. They're not. Okay, what we're essentially looking at is the side of a building with these silhouettes, and you have these little kind of dramas playing out. And I think something that's really neat about this image is that while they're kind of individual vignettes, I think that you get a kind of conceptual continuation between the different frames. So if you look at, for instance, the couple fighting in the upper left, and then the grandfather and the child cocking his snook. Conceptually, those feel like they're doing a kind of call and response thing, which I find really interesting. Okay. Tableau number 2, New York's printscape. So technology and commercial innovations weren't the only thing driving innovation in 19th century comics. This was also being driven by what we would think of as the kind of cultural developments that were really kind of coalescing around New York in the 1850s and 1860s. At this time, an unprecedented number of cultural workers migrated to Lower Manhattan, attracted by economic opportunities presented by the publishing industry and the adjacent entertainment district. The resulting concentration of creative types led to a cosmopolitan atmosphere unparalleled in the U.S. at any time before. Unlike previous generations of U.S. writers and artists, the figures who gathered in mid-19th century New York dwelled at the fringes of polite society and pursued social nobility through labor. Writers, artists, actors, and editors regularly met at restaurants, bars, and cafes such as Crook and Duff, Pfaff's Cellar, and the Howell's Tavern, where they drank beer, ate German pancakes, and discussed their creative endeavors. They lived together in boarding houses and loafed about the streets in search of entertainment, even as they maintained publication schedules. And out of this milieu emerged new approaches to American literature and art, shaped by urban life and dedicated to a broad, egalitarian version of republicanism. This newer brand of urban literature and art was best conveyed by Walt Whitman's innovative verse and bold assertion that the roughs and beards, the vast masses, were really what gave the U.S. its fullest poetical nature. And so I think what we're looking at, and one of the big themes of the book, is that comics are right in there with this community, and it's what I would describe as a kind of insurgent romanticism. For this reason, I often think of the comic artists of the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s as akin maybe to the kind of comic artists of the underground in the 1970s, where there's just wild kind of innovation, but also lots of kind of bohemianism and lots of sort of counterculture, stuff at work. And so comic artists were integral figures in this scene. For instance, the author Thomas Butler Gunn characterized the prolific artist Frank Bellew as a fixture among New York's cultural luminaries. Bellew was regularly spotted in Howell's Tavern alongside the likes of the poet Walt Whitman, the Bohemian editor Henry Clapp, and the actor John Brewham. Bellew was said to recognize everyone, right? And this is, so just to kind of zoom in, this is Whitman, Clapp, Brougham, and then Bellew, right? And so the thing that Gunn says about Bellew is that he kind of sits in the back of Howell's Tavern and is observing all of these figures, and by the end of the night can sketch them all, with his eyes closed and one hand tied behind his back. It's a little bit of embellishment, clearly, but I don't know, Frank Bellew is a pretty extraordinary figure. And the visual records we have of comic artists are really revealing. I think they give us a flavor of the sort of urban romantic subcultures that we're talking about. So for instance, what we're looking at here is John McLennan, who's really a very important kind of sequential artist as well, and Thomas Nast, right? And they're both dressed in a way that absolutely would have caused a stir on the streets in 19th century New York. McLennan, for instance, has this huge walrus mustache, this frock coat, and he's wearing a fishing hat because he loves fishing. Okay. And the urban origins of these comics emerged in what I would describe as their kind of freewheeling and expansive sensibility. This could take many forms. In some cases, it meant shifting the kinds of subjects deemed appropriate for comic drawing. Like the social world of Whitman's poetry, comics engaged with a larger, more inclusive version of American culture. To that end, comics were often understood as a form of observational realism, capturing the kind of underlying mood and rhythms of American culture. So something that really distinguishes comics a lot of this time, many of the ones in this vein, is that they're really mundane. They're out there sort of observing the tendencies and mannerisms of people on the street, and a lot of the time that's enough. Sometimes these forms of observational realism could extend to attempts to present an image of the city's hidden inner workings. For instance, in this surprising sequence, what we're tracing is the course of a hoop dress from factory workers into the parlor, and then kind of after the woman has finished dressing, or rather after the evening's over. And I think we get this kind of striking parallel there between the two forms of labor, one taking place on the factory floor and one taking place sort of, as a servant of the household. In other cases, these insurgent forms of romanticism led comic artists to present readers with a parade of outcasts, artists, animals, mischievous children, and other interrupters of polite social order who didn't conform to the stultifying conventions of bourgeois society. And so this is one of, I mentioned Frank Bellew earlier, and this is one of many exploding pig cartoons that Frank Bellew did over the years. I'm glad you laughed at that. Anyway, but Bellew is interesting because he derives this whole transcendentalist-inspired philosophy to humor that he calls merrymaking. And essentially for Bellew, it's these like interruptions to polite society, that are sort of the escape valve for modern society, right? You need to laugh is literally kind of the way that Bellew wants to think about that. And so exploding pigs, why not, right? It's going to break up the routine. Bellew, by the way, along with these types of things, did some comics that really, really look like precursors to the Sunday Funnies. And I think that approach of what he would call merrymaking is very much in that vein. I think we can see a lot of Buster Brown, for instance, in his Master Charlie series. Okay. And since Newspaper Row was so close to the theater districts, artists regularly attended the theater, and this influence is often apparent in the themes, figures, and organizations that artists used for their comics. So publishers featured images of stages and ticket booths. They formatted text as play script. We can see there how they're adapting the gestures of stage performers, right? And so this is all within walking distance of the publishing houses. And they even created illustrations imagining performances that could never appear on a public stage. Some of these, like the one pictured here, involve drag performance and very direct expressions of queer desire. It's a fascinating kind of image. I'd love to talk about it in the Q&A if folks are curious. Tableau number 3, Augustus Hoppin abroad. Now, in our last few minutes, I'd like to move from a place where we can begin to see maybe a through line of comics to a place where a through line's not so clear. That is a genre of comics that were lost. One of the things that really fascinates me and continues to fascinate me about the project is that so much of this creativity that kind of flowers up in the 1850s and 1860s goes away when you hit the Sunday Funnies. You don't see nearly as much of a kind of improvisational approach. And the travel genre is a really kind of key example of this for me. So one of the very, very first things that publishers and artists in the US start doing when they get a hold of these French picaresque comics is that they find ways to kind of fit the roving picaresque to what they consider American cultural identity. And so travel is a great way to do that, and specifically travel into the frontiers, right? So you see this kind of parade of protagonists and storylines that mingled crude Yankee humor with colonialist undertones. So whether characters were wrestling alligators or scandalizing the sensibilities of, quote, natives, readers were consistently reminded that Americans were rugged individualists destined to conquer vast swaths of territory, often in spite of their own buffoonish tendencies. But there were other themes too. For example, there was a whole subgenre of comics about people who would go into nature and encounter giant mosquitoes. In most cases, these mosquitoes were from New Jersey. I don't understand why that's funny. I'm not from the Northeast. But I can say, as somebody who just spent a summer in Birmingham, Alabama, I can really identify. So anyway, as we kind of think about the travel genre, though, a really key figure and somebody who I think takes it away from this kind of cruder Yankee humor that you see is Augustus Hoppin. He is the most prolific artist of travel narratives and develops various iterations of the travelogue strip over the course of about 30 years. So the first strips that he does appear in about 1852, with the last ones, which are by then graphic albums, appearing in 1880 or so. And Hoppin has this just extraordinary evolution over this period in time. And I think something too that is notable about Hoppin, and I think the travel genre in general, is that you rarely see scenery in travel comics of the 19th century, at least in the US. And a big reason for that is that what's going on is that there's an interest in kind of the experience of travel, right? So that what you're being asked to consider and think about is not the kind of sublime mountain landscape. They kind of leave that to painters, right? But instead the kind of change in the subject, And so Hoppin's critics will talk about him in precisely these terms, right? One reviewer of Hoppin wrote, as all know, an apparently careless etching is usually far more spirited and natural than an elaborate steel engraving. Mr. Hoppin's etchings tell those who have not been in Egypt far more about the country, its wonders, and its ways than even photographs do, right? So there's something being posited there about just the kind of dashed off, apparently careless etching or the kind of quick swoop of a pencil or something like that, right? It's in the moment. Now, Hoppin's earliest travel comics are based loosely on his experience as a young man. And on the surface, these early travel comics really read a lot like the regionalist slapstick that we saw earlier, replete with kind of crude humor and jingoistic fervor. However, when we closely look at these, what we can notice is that he's even then using them as this kind of vehicle for subtle introspection. So early episodes, and the series was called Jonathan Abroad, and it was published in Yankee Notions, and it hewed closely to those stock conventions of works like Journey to Gold Diggins. So Jonathan, that's the character, his encounters often have less to do with exploring the cultures he visits than acting as a kind of gadfly, a sort of wise fool who gleefully thumbs his nose at European institutions. For instance, a trip to the Royal Academy results in a sly contrast between Jonathan's folksy empiricism and the pretensions of English socialites. In his naivete, Jonathan glides straight past the artwork at the Royal Academy and fixes his gaze on the strangeness of the visitors who crowd the gallery, fawning over the comparably unremarkable paintings. Okay. But later installments of Jonathan Abroad offer a much different vision of Americans' presence in the Old World. Shifting away from Jonathan's breaches of social etiquette, Hoppin depicts the American encounter with the ethnic other with delicacy and admiration. Hoppin's episodes in Paris and the Middle East are especially attentive to Jonathan's sincere attraction to other cultures. In one series of frames, Jonathan finds himself so taken with French culture and urban sophistication that he can't stop himself from giving money to the various charming French merchants he encounters. Grisette, a glove saleswoman, makes him feel, quote, as skittish as a 4-year-old. Okay. And the tone and content of Jonathan Abroad really foreshadows the Amerocentric travel writing that we see with Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad. And in fact, there's ample reason to believe that Twain drew his inspiration directly from Hoppin's travel comics. Many of Twain's early writings appear in Yankee Notions alongside Hoppin's work, while Hoppin himself was the illustrator for the Gilded Age. And in fact, Twain even includes a scene in Innocents Abroad that closely resembles Hoppin's purchasing of the gloves from the French saleswoman. There's that theft theme again. And the resemblance between Twain and Hoppin even extended to the publication of Innocents Abroad. So we can see the way that on the right, this was laid out in Yankee Notions, and then in the left, the way that the original Fay and Dixon engravings were done for Twain's Innocents Abroad in 1869, almost 20 years later. And something that's fascinating, and these I think are absolute jewels of the American Antiquarian Society's collection. So these are little sketch cards or sketches that Hoppin did. So he was doing the grand tour in Europe, and in the meantime, right, so this is what's in back of the comics, right? So he's doing this at roughly the same time he's doing Jonathan Abroad. And they're just extraordinary kinds of pieces. As the years progressed, Hoppin would pursue multiple directions as he continued to develop his version of the visual travelogue. These appeared in humor magazines, mainstream periodicals like Harper's Weekly, and full-length picture books. Some of these works exaggerate the slapstick elements that we see in Jonathan Abroad, while others work to develop the travelogue strip into a relatively genteel piece of literature preoccupied with self-reflection through travel, right? So Hoppin's getting increasingly sophisticated as he's doing this over the next 30 years. On the humorous side, a highlight of the more humorous pieces is a graphic album called Hay Fever, and it's a very funny send-up of what's known as hay fever tourism. And this was this 19th century practice where people would travel to resort areas and faraway destinations to escape their allergies in the spring. At least that's why they claimed they were traveling. And the album follows Mr. Weepy, who suffers from allergies and travels throughout the US in search of regions free of nasal irritants. The book's central gag lies with the irony that the psychic and spiritual renewal imagined by 19th century travel writers consistently fails to offer any relief because Mr. Weepy keeps sneezing. Here he is with some prairie dogs, sneezing. Here he is with all of his handkerchiefs laid out. And here he is trying to make his escape in a hot air balloon, trailed by a, quote, little ballast in the shape of 10 dozen handkerchiefs. Okay. But where Hoppin eventually lands is not necessarily the comedic, but instead on realism. I find his graphic album On the Nile to be among the most significant of Hoppin's visual travel logs because it marks a concerted effort to push graphic narrative in an increasingly ambitious direction. It is in many ways an attempt to imagine the expansive possibilities for what could be accomplished through visual storytelling. And unlike earlier works, On the Nile demands a much slower and much more involved reading style. The book features long blocks of ekphrastic description accompanied by intricate photorealistic illustrations. Much of this is done to facilitate the rich variety of perspectives and subjective experiences that Hoppin looks to achieve through visual storytelling. Most notably, Hoppin consistently depicts himself watching and discusses his own process of watching. Hence, in the plate Way scenes, he gives nearly equal weight to a survey of the various Egyptian subjects and the Americans who are observing them. In doing so, he interrogates the tensions of the tourist's gaze. And in particular, he invites his readers to question how his own, that is Augustus Hoppin's own presence, is premised on a consumer ideology and thus the extent to which it has become harmful to the places he's visiting. Hoppin will, for instance, write of his misgiving over tour guides who direct him only to the carefully manicured images of, quote, romantic clusters of white villages, asking him to, quote, form our judgment simply from the picture before us while ignoring the distress and poverty of the people. So rather than adopting the uncritical gaze of the tourist, Hoppin looks inward and starts using his artwork to think about what it means for him to be there and how he might create a more empathetic way for his own audience back in the US to relate to colonial scenes and subjects. It's a strikingly sophisticated move. And as much as Hoppin seems to maintain an earnest tone, we occasionally spot small reminders that he's working in a genre that finds its origin in humor and wit, maintaining the hallmarks that we talked about at the very beginning with Toepfer's Monsieur Vieuxbois. And we see this in particular with the way that Hoppin will depict animals. For instance, a distressed donkey named Toby Number 1 furrows his brow with a suspiciously human facial expression as his trainer prepares him for cargo. And I can say this as my dog trainer recently talked about our dog and said she has people eyes, you know. And I think there's a little bit of a people eyes joke going on in this illustration. But what it really points up for me is that this momentary cartoonish humor in an otherwise realistic world shows us how, you know, even then in the late 1870s, right, he's thinking about this as a comedic genre, but a comedic genre that's kind of like pushing outward, pushing to more sort of ambitious heights, right? That it's able to be capable of containing the complex mix of autobiography, journalism, and cultural commentary that went into the very best travel writing. And so this kind of brings me to the present day, which is to say that it brings an important parallel to modern comic artists. By fitting the humorous comic strip to what one might consider sophisticated or complex subject matter, Hoppin's following a trajectory that resembles many of today's most significant comic artists. So by way of closing, I'd like to turn us to graphic narrative today. Part of the reason that literary critics and language people have gotten so excited about comics in recent years is the way that you have figures deconstructing the comic strip, right? Pulling apart those familiar conventions of the panel grid, of the speech balloon, and thinking about new ways to do visual narrative. And yet, when I think back to 19th century comics, I think to myself, there is nothing new about that. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Alex, thank you. That was marvelous. We have plenty of time for questions. I would just ask you to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. We'll have two mics coming to you. One is our mic and the other is C-SPAN's mic. Please wait for them both to get to you and then ask your question. So please, if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand and we will get this going.
It's a little intimidating. Hi, thank you for a really fascinating talk of material that I myself am not very familiar with. You talked about part of the developments in this new comic mode is being rooted in the bohemian culture of New York as a print center. I'm wondering if different styles of comics appeared in different classes of illustrated magazines, magazines that were pitched to middle class, lower class, working class versus upper class and elite audiences. And if so, what are some of the key differences you found in the visual styles of comics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, you see a huge range. And at either end of the kind of polls, like at one end of the polls is Vanity Fair, which is very explicitly bohemian, and yeah, I mean, often has, a pretty gruff visual style. At the other end of the spectrum would be something like Frank Leslie's Budget of Fun, which is explicitly family friendly and explicitly, saying we're not going to use any obscenity, and they'll point to other humor magazines in those ranges. One of the most extraordinary stories to come out of this is Knickknacks, which was a humor magazine after, or it started in the 1850s and then has this radical change in the 1860s. And what happens at Knickknacks, I promise this story is worth it. What happens at Knickknacks is that the paper is left to Mary Levison. So she's married to the former owner, right? And so she's widowed. And lots of figures in New York, there's this huge kind of level of gossip about how dare she hang on to this publication. But after Mary Levison gets a hold of Knickknacks, it starts catering to women, right? So you'll see things like, ads for hoop skirts, ads for sewing machines, female contest winners in the pages of Knickknacks. And the artistic style in that particular magazine takes such a dramatic turn to where they're developing, these beautifully wrought kind of images that are paying a lot of attention to fashion, are happening in kind of domestic settings, And so, yeah, I mean, there's a huge range of different types of magazines, and the artwork certainly kind of shows that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to start by saying maybe you can tell us the difference between cartoon and comic quickly to make sure that I'm using the language correctly.
Yeah.
But I'm also looking for another kind of distinction is, say, On the Nile to me looked like an illustration. So where's the line? When does it become a comic or an illustration with a comic element in it?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the interaction between images. So an illustration, the text for an illustration, and this comes from Will Eisner, the kind of great comic artist who sort of laid down the law on what's a comic and what's not. And it's really kind of, I think, been a lasting articulation of that. But if you have interaction between the illustration and the image, then you start getting into the kind of work that comic artists do. Whereas if it's just kind of reiterating that, or if it's just an interpretation of the text, that tends to be more what we would think of as an illustration, right? So for instance, the famous images in like Alice in Wonderland, that's a kind of textbook example of illustrations, because although they're kind of crafting, the landscape of Wonderland, it's really an interpretation of what's in the text. It's not creating a kind of sense of rhythm and timing or a sort of meaningful shift in the image.
Here, I can move to you. So my question, I guess, is with all of the like plagiarism sort of things going on, was that just seen as like a part of the like practice of like, oh, we're all sharing ideas here, and like if you make something really good, Mark Twain might rip it off, or is it a like screw that guy?
Yeah,
he took my idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the creators of the images, and I mean, Twain is famous for being really cranky about people ripping off his text and stuff. But I think as far as the images, it's really, really common. It's common practice for plates to be reused, and often without the permission of the artist. And there's often a kind of and there seems to be what we would think of as like a comfort level with the audience in terms of having images kind of mushed together or sort of rearranged. So for instance, there's a relatively notorious graphic album called The Adventures of Ferdinand Flipper. And it's all pilfered plates, and they've all just been kind of rearranged into this kind of funny and weird story. And the first couple of times I read it, I was like, man, my head is going to explode, until I realized what was going on, which is to say that it was this collage of comics that, or rather of single illustrations from kind of all over the place, that they're arranging into just this loopy, wacky story that kind of takes him, everywhere. But I have to think that an audience reading something like that would not be fooled. Do you know what I mean? It would be much more, I don't think it was a swindle. I think we've put together this really interesting kind of like graphic album that you can keep on your, coffee table. And it'll be kind of a laugh to kind of think about the different sorts of ways that the images crash against each other. And I think a lot of what that's premised on is that images were relatively rare in the 1850s, right? It's still this exciting spectacle to have one in your hands,
You talked a bit about New York as being sort of the central location for all of this. Were there other places where there was a lot of cartooning going on or graphic work going on, and were there any regional differences between something that might have happened in Baltimore and something that might have happened somewhere else?
Yeah. Philadelphia is another hot spot. Philadelphia doesn't have nearly the kind of culture for sequential art, but you see, caricature and things coming out of Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a notable humor magazine that has some of the earliest sequential art. So that magazine is called The John Donkey. With regional differences, it's hard to say. Within New York, there's so many kind of differences, even within that print culture, that I don't know that I would be comfortable saying that, there's a kind of regional style. Yeah.
Can you say something a little bit more about demand and distribution of these? And I'm taking this from your very last comment, whether were these local cultures of humor and creativity, or were they distributed broadly across the country?
That's a good question. I don't know. I know that the graphic albums get distributed broadly, right? You see advertisements, kind of all up and down the East Coast, and then even out into the Midwest and the West for graphic albums. And the magazines have huge circulation. So Yankee Notions, reports a circulation of something like 10,000. I think that number is reliable. So yeah, they're widespread, I think we got another one here.
So do you know, this is more like on the business side of it, I guess. Sorry, business major.
That's okay.
But like, obviously now like artists get like royalties and like we have to pay in order to like print their comics and things. So when they were distributed like 10,000 times, was it a like, cool, you got your $10 in the beginning?
No.
Or like how were they
Yeah.
paid if they were clearly turning out so much work? Was that like necessity or just passion or both?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both. I mean, the pay doesn't seem to be great. They are, they're a lot like pulp writers where they're just working day and night and getting kind of individual commissions. So the payment style that you're describing is, $10, be lucky, some individual artists do kind of get to move up once their profile gets raised a little bit. I think we all know, Thomas Nast, who's not really doing sequential comics, but is famously wealthy, and kind of goes into publishing himself. But the comic artists themselves really don't, nobody's able to sustain anything like what Nast has. Bellew, so Frank Bellew, who's kind of the second best paid cartoonist after Nast, works and works and works, and for a while has a very kind of comfortable living, but certainly dies broke, and there are these kind of very sad newspaper notices kind of ridiculing Bellew for being so famous but also being so broke. It's really kind of a sad situation. And I think another thing that Richard Samuel West, who's a real kind of authority on 19th century periodical culture, has described to me is that a lot of them had trouble keeping their money, in that it was a kind of party lifestyle, so that when you got money, you spent it, right? You did the big dinner, you went out for drinks, and then your money was gone, and then you just kind of start all over again, and you draw some more funny pictures,
Thank you. So I'm curious about cross-fertilization with other media. Photography would have existed certainly by the 1850s. And then I'm also thinking about the amazing sort of visual diaries that we see from the Civil War, for example. So I'm wondering about how genre kind of develops in a culture where there are all these other new media happening.
Yeah. So I can't speak specifically to photography, but what I can speak to are optical toys and instruments. So, they're fascinated by, things like the phenakistoscope or like the stereoscope. And so one of the things I do talk about in the book is the way that movement is often mediated through these kind of early optical instruments. And in many cases, right, if you'll stay with me on this, when we read comics today, we're used to what you describe as a kind of cinematic style of movement, right? So it's fluid. One sort of movement glides kind of right into another, right? Something that's very, very common to see in 19th century comics is a kind of like flipping back and forth, right? So it's that kind of examination that you would have with like a flip book or like the spinning disc, and so you're watching the movement again and again and again. It's really kind of a neat phenomenon. So you'll see that kind of like cross-fertilization, with those other types of things. Photography, I don't know, like Hoppin's On the Nile seems certainly influenced by photography, but I can't speak to kind of specific instances. They love making fun of photography, right? So you'll see a lot of cartoons and comics about the sort of distortions with like daguerreotypes and things. So people's faces will, get like curl up and things like that. I think we got one over here.
This is intimidating. So I'm really curious too about cross-fertilization. So these are comic strips. So there's the politics of the time. So were there intersections between the Civil War, the politics, and the comic strip?
Occasionally. So there aren't sort of ongoing sustained political comic strips, right? The comic strip medium tends to be reserved for kind of light humor and observations of everyday life. Occasionally during the Civil War, though, you do see these like really, really interesting efforts to like shoehorn politics into it. So, for instance, Leslie's Budget of Fun has a large number of comics where, we talked about earlier, this is the family-friendly magazine. And so they go from kind of polite, family humor about, wholesome moms and dads and children and stuff like that to wholesome humor about soldiers, right? And so it's funny kinds of, you'll have soldiers doing like backflips and things like that in the comics.
Alex, thank you so much. Let's give Alex Beringer a round of applause. For those of you who are here in Worcester with us this evening, we have copies of Alex's book, Lost Literacies, for sale in the lobby, and he would be delighted to sign the book for you if you would like to have your own copy. If you are watching on our YouTube audience, we have a link to the discounted copy that you can get from the publisher. We want to thank all of you who've been part of our audience this evening, whether you're here with us in Worcester or whether you're watching on YouTube. Please feel free to tell your friends about this. It will be available on our YouTube channel very soon, and it will be available on C-SPAN, so keep your eyes on C-SPAN schedules over the weeks and months ahead. We have lots of great programs coming up this fall. This was just the first. Next Thursday, September 26th at 2 in the afternoon, Amy Gore will be talking about her book, Body Anatomy, Body Politics and Materiality in Indigenous Book History. That's a virtual program. So is our next program after that called Curious Species, How Animals Made Natural History with Whitney Robles. That's on Tuesday evening, October 1st. We've got lots more coming up. Please check out our website, AmericanAntiquarian.org, for information on those programs. And for now, thank you all and have a good evening.